we're on to a new assignment. And this one's a little bit more complex, but doable. It's just a challenge. It's not meant to be impossible to do. It's on dealing with sources and writing about your research that you do. The class itself is entitled Writing and Research. It should make sense that we're into the second part of that title. We examine research while building on previous assignments. We haven't really left description behind. We haven't really left dealing with assumptions, facts, and inferences. It naturally follows that those things are central to dealing with research too. So, each assignment building on the previous one. In this assignment, as you know from what we've said in class, you're asked to make a brief annotated bibliography or a review of sources based on a topic that you choose. Now, a couple of things about this. Annotated bibliography is a big title, and I use that title because other classes will use that title. It's not an unimportant title, and you ought to get used to using them. You've probably done some version of this before, but we're going to call it the annotated bibliography. It's where you review your sources. It's done so frequently that we ought to do it, and we ought to do it well and understand why it's done. In this case, as you know from the assignment, I'll choose one source, and you choose the second source, and you'll be asked how they compare. How do they cover the topic? That'll be the key thing that I'm looking for when I'm taking a look at the paper. And notice it's not on the topic itself. I want to know how the source covers the topic. That's a pretty key distinction that not every student gets the first time through. We want to understand how the source covers the topic and what makes that source a good source to turn to if you're trying to find information out about that topic. Why do we do it this way? It really, to my mind, is the natural progress of research. We have a topic when we want to research something that interests us, then we find more about that topic through research, then we say something about that research. It really should go step, step, step. It really should be natural to us to want to find more information and then want to write about it. It's the people who take shortcuts where they want to write about the topic before they've actually researched it because they know all about it already, who worry me because, of course, that's a statement in our society. We have people, oftentimes blowhards, bloviating about this and that because they know it all already. They don't need to research it, and that's not what we're doing. You're better than that. You know that any good person will acknowledge that they don't know everything and that they'll have to look it up or actually do some research to find out about that subject. Of course, we're trying to avoid bad sources. That makes sense. I've had a whole host of bad sources, but oftentimes those students will be clueless as to how we're evaluating sources. Rather than just hand you some sources, I want you to help justify what makes your sources good. And naturally, it's to understand the importance of good sources for our research, how they influence our opinions and what we write and say. In that last topic, let's think about this. We're obviously defining good sources, and not just with this idea that we ought to be able to agree with them, or that they're the easiest sources that we can get. We just Google them, and there they were. Or they're those that were handed to us from someone else, a brother, a sister, a recycled paper that we got from some other place. No, we're trying to take the better path, and the better path is to understand what makes those sources good first before we actually come to write on them. We're doing this because it allows us to see an inductive treatment of sources, just as with Samuel Scudder, where he pieced together facts of existence, in this case, his fish, to understand the larger truths about science and about himself and about observation that he does. So too are we taking a look at our sources, and thank goodness we're looking at less smelly sources than a fish, and drawing some general conclusions about what makes for those sources and what makes for good sources. Let's see this go on in a paper. Here we have a typical paper for an annotated bibliography. Sometimes you'll get the bibliographic citation at the beginning and the annotation afterwards. In this case, I wanted to keep it in a natural progression of the assignments that we've done for class, so I'd like you to actually keep the writing at the beginning. I think it makes most sense to do that, and then students won't get confused about where the writing should go. Notice you have your heading. You even have a title if you want. It doesn't have to be fancy. And the introduction doesn't even have to be present for an annotated bibliography. I'd like to cut to the chase. Tell me about your first source. Titled The Obesity Epidemic, the Congressional Quarterly article on this topic was very thorough. And we'll go on from there. Notice our titles are treated correctly here. The smaller unit is the one in quotes. The larger title is the one in italics. That's how titles go. Larger units, books, titles of films, titles of periodicals, and the larger scheme of things are in italics. Titles of articles, chapters, poems, smaller units usually get the quotation marks, and that's how it goes. Okay. This particular student, as you no doubt can see from the highlighting, highlights the coverage of the source, and that makes it a good source. That's what we've highlighted here. You do not have to do highlighting, but the idea is that you're pointing out what makes for the good source. I did that here for the demonstration in class. They look at the subject from every angle, and their coverage of the topic makes it a pretty readable and good source. It's the coverage that's most important for this student. And they compare it to the second source, even offering this as a conclusion. What makes for a good source? There are several things. He says how it covers the topic and how it must be accurate. And of course the natural question is, how do you know it covers it adequately? How do you know it's accurate? But that's what you'll be able to tell me in your review of sources. This student has an interesting conclusion. I'll have talked about it in class too, but I think it's so important. I'll hit home here too with this idea. This student says, I started this research looking for bias because we're always told to look for that in sources, but the only bias I could detect in these sources was that they wanted readers to understand the big picture. Some subjects won't have the typical bias or treatment of bias, and so that's why I want you to discover your criteria for what makes a good source inductively. That should make sense. Sometimes it'll be the coverage of the source. Sometimes it'll be the background given. Sometimes the fact that it'll give information clearly about a complex source, in which case bias doesn't really factor into it, does it? Okay, and then we have our citation given at the end of the document. That's pretty typical in both the research papers and in annotated bibliographies. And once you've done this assignment, and if you've done it well, you've gotten this out of the way. And so that will be fantastic. They're given in hanging and dented paragraphs. In another video and in class, I'll have worked on giving good citation style so that you do it correctly. In this case, notice a couple of things just about it from the very start. It starts with an author, and how important is that? In a future video, I'm going to explain about how a citation works and why authors are important still, why we should know something about them. You might just keep that in mind as we progress and talk further about how we use the sources that we do. This citation is given so that your teacher can check your citations, make sure they're accurate, but also make sure that they could find the sources too, should they be interested in finding them. Okay, and that's pretty standard for why sources and citations are given in the first place. And that's an annotated bibliography. Remember, I'm asking you to talk about your sources and how they cover the topic. Right? Is it a good source? What makes it a good source? How can you tell it's a good source? How does it compare to other sources, which also could be good? Going back to this slide that I think is kind of important on this subject. Here we are again. Okay. And again, we're looking at those sources just as Sam Scudder looked at the fish and trying to determine what makes it a good source on this particular topic. It's going to vary a little bit across the different topics that you choose and according to the different things that each student wants to find in sources. But generally speaking, illuminating that and talking about that is key to the assignment, really key to future assignments. Why is it a good source? Here's why it's a good source. Why is this reading good? Here's why. Why is this author authoritative? Here's why. Why is this a good source for my topic? Here is why. You're explaining yourself. You're describing why the source works for this topic that you've chosen. Good luck.